Imagine being the absolute most powerful person on the planet. You have the strongest military, the most robust economy, and unrivaled global influence. But when the invitations for the most critical, world-altering event in human history are finally handed out, your name isn't even on the list. You're completely ghosted. That is the exact, deeply unsettling paradox we crash into when we look at the timeline of the end times. How is it logically possible that the Bible, an ancient text that flawlessly predicted the rise and spectacular fall of empires like Babylon, Greece, and Rome, doesn't dedicate a single, obvious chapter to the United States of America? It's the ultimate historical elephant in the room. Most mainstream theologians will confidently tell you that America simply isn't in the text, but they are dead wrong. The greatest superpower in human history isn't missing. It's just hiding in plain sight behind a very dark, incredibly uncomfortable prophetic alias. Today, we are going to strip away all the traditional noise and uncover three specific, undeniable clues that reveal America's true destiny before the final countdown begins. And trust me, by the time we hit that third clue, the terrifying headlines you are seeing on the news right now are going to make perfect, chilling sense. It's almost comical how hard we look for our own reflection when we read ancient texts, isn't it? We flip frantically through the mysterious pages of Revelation, desperately looking for a star-spangled banner hidden somewhere between the ancient lines. It is basic human nature to want to know that the most powerful nation in human history has a starring role in the universe's final act. Because of this, people start grasping at straws, looking for anything that even remotely resembles the modern superpower we know today. We want to be the main character so badly that we often twist the scriptures to fit our evening news. And honestly, that is exactly where things start to get a little bit too creative for our own good. You see, there is this one specific passage in Revelation chapter 12 that gets a lot of Western readers incredibly excited. It talks about a woman who clearly represents Israel, fleeing into the wilderness to escape the wrath of a great dragon. And how exactly does she manage to escape this impossible situation? The text explicitly says she is given the two wings of a great eagle to fly to her designated place of safety. Now, if you grew up in the US, or if you've just watched enough Hollywood action movies, your brain immediately connects those dots. An eagle? A dramatic rescue mission? Military might? Boom, it automatically has to be the United States Air Force swooping in to save the day. It genuinely sounds like the perfect blockbuster movie plot, doesn't it? You can almost picture the F-22 Raptors streaking across the Middle Eastern sky, fulfilling an ancient prophecy with precision-guided munitions. It is a very comforting thought, especially when you consider the long-standing historical alliance between the United States and Israel. We absolutely love the idea of being the geopolitical hero of the story, the cavalry riding over the hill at the darkest possible hour. But here is the hard truth about ancient biblical prophecies. They were not written with modern Hollywood scriptwriters in mind. They were written by Hebrew scholars who operated with a completely different cultural and historical frame of reference. To truly understand the symbol of the eagle, we have to stop staring at the back of a $1 bill and start looking back at the book of Exodus. Thousands of years before anyone ever dreamed of a supersonic fighter jet, God used this exact same imagery with his people. In Exodus 19, when he is reminding the Israelites how he miraculously delivered them from the grip of Egypt, he doesn't mention chariots, alliances, or armies. He says, "You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." Was there a literal flock of giant birds carrying millions of people? Of course not. It was a beautiful, powerful metaphor for divine, miraculous intervention. God was clearly stating that he alone was responsible for their rescue, lifting them out of absolute danger with overwhelming strength and intimate care. So when the Apostle John writes Revelation 12 and uses that identical phrase, he isn't pointing his finger toward a modern geopolitical ally sitting across the Atlantic Ocean. He is pointing straight up. He is telling us that Israel's ultimate survival in the end times won't depend on foreign policy, coalition forces, or the bloated military budget of a Western superpower. It is going to be a massive divine rescue operation handled by God himself. That fundamentally means Washington, D.C. is not the savior in this prophetic chapter, and the eagle's wings belong to the Creator, not the Pentagon. This realization strips away our modern arrogance and forces us to look elsewhere to find America's true role in the chaotic days ahead. If the United States isn't the heroic eagle swooping in to save the day, then where exactly is it hiding in the text? Well, some scholars believe the answer isn't found in a heroic symbol of rescue at all, but rather in a chilling, detailed portrait of unbelievable luxury, deep corruption, and a sudden downfall that will shock the entire world. Let's be honest for a second. Nobody really wants to be the villain in the grand finale of human history, do they? When we read about the glorious cities of the ancient world falling into absolute ruin, it is incredibly easy to point our fingers at everyone else but ourselves. We sit comfortably in our modern, air-conditioned homes and assume that the terrifying prophecies of Revelation are reserved for some distant, cartoonishly evil empire in the Middle East or Europe. But when you actually sit down and dissect Revelation chapter 18, a very different, deeply unsettling picture starts to emerge right before your eyes. It describes a mysterious, overwhelmingly powerful entity known only as Mystery Babylon, and the details are honestly a little too close to home. The text paints a vivid portrait of a nation that essentially runs the entire global economy, enriching the merchants of the earth through its insatiable appetite for luxury and consumerism. Just think about the sheer volume of goods that flow into our ports every single day, filling endless warehouses and giant big-box stores. This prophetic Babylon is described as a massive maritime power, importing everything from precious metals and fine linens to spices, wine, and everyday commodities. If you read the ancient inventory list in Revelation, it sounds exactly like a modern global supply chain feeding an unbelievably wealthy consumer society. The merchants of the earth grow rich beyond their wildest dreams simply by doing business with her, relying entirely on her massive economic engine. It is an economic superpower that consumes at a staggering rate, driving the financial markets of the entire world with its unparalleled buying power. When you hold that biblical description up to the light, it is genuinely hard not to see a reflection of the modern American economic machine staring right back at you. You can almost think of this prophetic nation as the geopolitical equivalent of the RMS Titanic, sailing confidently through the icy waters of history. Everyone on board was absolutely convinced that it was the pinnacle of human engineering, a completely unsinkable marvel of modern luxury and overwhelming power. The band was playing cheerful tunes, the first-class passengers were sipping expensive champagne, and nobody paid any attention to the subtle warnings in the freezing air. Revelation 18 describes a nation with that exact same spirit of invincibility, boasting in its heart, "I sit as a queen, I am not a widow, and I will never see sorrow." It is that dangerous, blinding pride that comes from decades of unmatched prosperity, making its citizens believe that the good times will simply never stop rolling. They are so intoxicated by their own wealth and cultural dominance that they completely ignore the massive iceberg looming right in front of them. But this mystery nation isn't just an economic powerhouse. It is also a massive exporter of culture and ideology that deeply influences the rest of the planet. The text says that all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries, which is a poetic way of saying she exports her sins globally. Through movies, music, technology, and political influence, this modern Babylon shapes the moral compass. or the absolute lack thereof, for billions of people across the globe. We have essentially mass-produced a lifestyle of aggressive materialism and exported it to every single corner of the earth, from busy European capitals to quiet Asian villages. It is a cultural empire that dictates what the world wears, watches, listens to, and ultimately values above everything else. The spiritual decay originates from her shores and flows outward like a dark, intoxicating river, making the entire world completely drunk on her specific brand of rebellion. The most terrifying part of this entire prophecy, however, isn't the staggering wealth or the global influence. It is the breathtaking speed of its destruction. The Bible explicitly states that her plagues will come in a single day, and her massive economic empire will completely collapse in 1 hour. Imagine waking up on a normal Tuesday morning, grabbing your coffee, checking your phone, and realizing the entire global financial system has just evaporated. The merchants and sea captains who relied on her for their massive profits are described as standing far off, weeping and mourning as they watch her burn. They aren't rushing in to save her or fight for her, they are just absolutely paralyzed by the sudden, catastrophic loss of their biggest customer. The unsinkable ship goes down so fast that the rest of the world is left in a state of absolute, unprecedented shock. If this staggering prophecy truly is a blueprint of America's future, it explains exactly why she isn't around to stop the chaos of the Antichrist's global regime. She doesn't slowly fade away over centuries like the Roman Empire. She is violently and suddenly removed from the geopolitical chessboard, leaving a massive power vacuum behind. It is a chilling realization that the nation we assume will always be there to maintain global order might suddenly vanish from the equation in the blink of an eye. And that sudden absence becomes even more glaring when you look at other major prophetic events, like the massive future invasion of the Middle East. Because when a huge coalition of nations finally marches against Israel in the ultimate showdown, the once mighty Western voices don't send troops or carrier strike groups anymore. Instead, it seems like the remaining Western powers are reduced to nothing more than weak diplomatic protests, completely unable or unwilling to actually intervene. Let's shift our focus to one of the most heavily debated and deeply terrifying prophecies in the entire Bible, found right in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 38. It describes a massive future military coalition led by nations we know today as Russia and Iran, marching aggressively toward the mountains of Israel. Now, if you watch the evening news for even 5 minutes, you know that this specific geopolitical alignment is no longer just some ancient, dusty prediction. It is quite literally unfolding right in front of our eyes, with these exact nations forming tighter military and economic bonds than ever before. Naturally, when you picture a massive coalition attacking America's greatest ally in the Middle East, you immediately expect the United States to jump right into the fight. You expect the aircraft carriers to deploy, the rhetoric to heat up, and the world's biggest superpower to step in and save the day. But here is where the ancient text drops an absolute bombshell that leaves modern geopolitical analysts scratching their heads in disbelief. During this catastrophic invasion, there is a specific group of Western nations watching the event unfold, but they don't actually do anything to stop it. Ezekiel 38:13 says that Tarshish, with all its young lions, will essentially just send a strongly worded diplomatic memo to the invading armies. They look at this massive coalition storming into the Middle East and pathetically ask, "Have you come to take plunder? Have you gathered your army to take booty?" It is the ancient equivalent of sending an angry tweet or a useless note of protest while your best friend gets completely steamrolled in the schoolyard. There is absolutely no military retaliation, no shock and awe campaign, and certainly no American cavalry riding in to rescue the besieged nation. So to figure out why the West is suddenly so paralyzed, we have to play a little bit of historical detective work and identify exactly who Tarshish is. Ancient Tarshish was a famous maritime power located in the far west of the known biblical world, which historians widely agree points directly to the shores of Western Europe. More specifically, prophetic scholars have long associated the merchants of Tarshish with the seafaring, colonizing power of the British Empire. They were the ones who ruled the waves, established global trade routes, and planted their cultural and political flags all over the entire planet. This means the prophet Ezekiel is looking far into the future, past the Middle East, and focusing his gaze squarely on the powerful nations of the Western Hemisphere. He sees the old European establishment watching the apocalypse unfold, completely unable or entirely unwilling to physically intervene in the chaos. But the prophecy doesn't just stop at Tarshish. It gets incredibly specific by mentioning her young lions, or her literal offspring. In classic British heraldry and political cartoons, the United Kingdom has always been historically represented by the proud, roaring symbol of a mother lion. Therefore, the young lions are her colonial descendants, the powerful English-speaking nations that grew out of the British Empire to establish their own dominance. We are talking about nations like Canada, Australia, New Zealand and, you guessed it, the United States of America, the biggest and most powerful young lion of them all. Yet, in this critical, world-altering moment, the mighty American lion isn't roaring, baring its teeth, or flexing its unparalleled military muscle to protect its allies. Instead, the greatest superpower in human history is reduced to sitting on the sidelines, letting out a weak, helpless meow while the world burns. This stunning biblical revelation forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question that most politicians absolutely refuse to even acknowledge. If the United States is still the reigning global superpower during this future war, why on earth would they sit back and do absolutely nothing? The only logical explanation is that when this massive invasion finally kicks off, America is either completely distracted, entirely broke, or dangerously weak. You don't just sit back and watch the Middle East collapse unless you are physically or politically incapable of projecting power across the ocean anymore. The young lion has lost its teeth, stripped of its global influence, and forced to accept a humiliating backseat role in the final acts of human history. It is a sobering reality check that proves no empire, no matter how vast or heavily armed, gets to stay on top of the world forever. This brings up an even deeper, much more terrifying mystery that we desperately need to unravel if we want to understand our future. How does a nation with the most advanced military technology, the largest economy, and thousands of nuclear warheads become so incredibly paralyzed? You don't take down a superpower of that magnitude from the outside. You have to let it rot quietly from the inside out until it simply collapses under its own weight. Think about a giant, beautiful oak tree that looks completely solid from the outside, but is secretly being hollowed out by millions of invisible termites. One day, a strong gust of wind comes along, and the entire massive structure just comes crashing down into a pile of useless dust. It makes you wonder what kind of internal decay could actually cause the American empire to crumble before the first missile is ever even fired. It's almost comical how we constantly look to the sky for foreign missiles, when history shows that massive empires usually die by suicide. You don't actually need a massive sledgehammer to knock down a solid brick wall if you've got a little bit of time and patience. All you really have to do is introduce a colony of termites into the wooden support structure and just let them go to work. Slowly but surely, those tiny bugs will eat away at the very foundation of the building until it becomes dangerously hollow on the inside. Then, one day, the slightest breeze comes along, and the whole magnificent structure just collapses into a pile of useless rubble. That is exactly what happens when a superpower decides to completely abandon its foundational values and starts tearing itself apart from the inside out. Jesus himself laid out this exact geopolitical reality over 2,000 years ago when he said that a house divided against itself simply cannot stand. Honestly, it is one of the most profound, undisputed laws of human history, and yet modern nations completely ignore it to their own detriment. Right now, we are watching the most powerful country on the planet get completely ripped apart by intense, toxic political divisions that seem impossible to heal. Families are quite literally refusing to speak to each other over elections, and the cultural fabric that once held everyone together is hanging by a thread. It is a terrifying level of polarization that turns neighbors into bitter enemies and makes compromise look like an absolute act of treason. When a society is this fractured, you really don't need an invading army to destroy it because the citizens are already doing the job for them. But the political chaos is honestly just a symptom of a much deeper, far more insidious moral crisis that has infected the cultural bloodstream. For centuries, the United States leaned heavily on its Christian roots, which provided a shared moral compass and a solid baseline for right and wrong. Fast forward to today, and that compass hasn't just been broken, it has been completely thrown out the window and replaced with absolute moral relativism. We are living in a society that aggressively celebrates the exact same destructive behaviors that brought down the Roman Empire right before its epic collapse. It is incredibly arrogant to think that any nation can openly mock the God who blessed them and still expect to keep his divine protection. Eventually, God simply steps back, honors their tragic choice, and allows the nation to reap exactly what it has been stubbornly sowing for decades. Throwing gasoline on this blazing cultural fire is the staggering, almost incomprehensible economic debt that is quietly suffocating the nation's future. It is mind-boggling to realize that the most prosperous country in history is functioning on borrowed money, printing trillions of dollars out of thin air. We are completely addicted to a lifestyle of massive overspending, writing checks that our children and grandchildren will never actually be able to cash. That kind of reckless financial behavior isn't just a minor accounting error, it is a ticking time bomb waiting to absolutely decimate the global markets. You can't just keep piling up astronomical debt without eventually hitting a catastrophic tipping point where the entire economic house of cards comes crashing down. Financial ruin has historically been the final nail in the coffin for every major world empire, and the American ledger is currently bleeding profoundly red. So, when you combine a dangerously divided public, a massive moral freefall, and an absolutely crippled economy, you get a recipe for total paralysis. This perfectly explains why the great Western superpower is missing in action when the biblical timeline shifts into its most critical, apocalyptic phase. A country that is constantly fighting a vicious civil war of ideologies in its own streets simply doesn't have the energy to police the globe. They are way too distracted by their own internal bleeding to care about a massive military coalition marching aggressively toward the mountains of Israel. It is the tragic, quiet death of a superpower, slowly fading into obscurity, while the rest of the world braces for the ultimate geopolitical showdown. It makes you realize that the most devastating threats don't always come from foreign dictators or military alliances working in the shadows. But what if this internal rotting isn't the only thing that completely neutralizes this massive Western powerhouse right before the end times kick into high gear? What if there is another, far more sudden event that absolutely strips the nation of its most vital, foundational people in the blink of an eye? Imagine the sheer, unprecedented chaos of waking up one morning to find that millions of your most productive, honest citizens have just inexplicably vanished. I'm talking about a catastrophic disappearance that instantly cripples the military, the power grid, the agricultural sector, and every major supply chain across the board. If you thought the slow, painful decay of a divided house was terrifying, just wait until you see what happens when the salt and light are suddenly removed. It would plunge the entire hemisphere into an irreversible dark age overnight, setting the perfect stage for a global dictator to step right in. Let's take a wild step back for a second and look at a completely different, almost supernatural angle that most geopolitical experts completely ignore. We are so incredibly obsessed with tracking troop movements, economic inflation, and political elections that we totally miss the ultimate prophetic wildcard. What if the massive, catastrophic blow to the American superpower doesn't actually come from a foreign enemy or a slow, agonizing internal decay? Imagine, just for a moment, a sudden, unprecedented global event that physically removes millions of the most productive citizens in the absolute blink of an eye. We are talking about the biblical concept of the Rapture, a silent, lightning-fast disappearance of believers that would instantly bring the world to a grinding halt. It sounds like straight-up science fiction to the secular world, but for serious students of biblical prophecy, it is the absolute next major event on the cosmic calendar. Now, you really have to think about the sheer demographics of the United States to understand why this specific event would absolutely shatter its infrastructure. Whether you agree with their theology or not, America currently holds the highest concentration of influential, Bible-believing Christians on the entire planet. We aren't just talking about a handful of pastors and grandmothers sitting quietly in Sunday school. We are talking about the absolute backbone of the nation's workforce. These are your top-tier military generals, your commercial airline pilots, the farmers growing your food, and the truckers keeping the entire supply chain moving. If you suddenly vacuumed all of these essential, hard-working people out of the country in a fraction of a second, the logistical nightmare would be absolutely unimaginable. The sudden chaotic absence of millions of key personnel would plunge every single city, state, and federal agency into total, irreversible darkness overnight. Think of the American empire as a massive, state-of-the-art jumbo jet, cruising comfortably at 600 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. It looks completely majestic and totally unstoppable from the ground, soaring right through the clouds with absolute confidence and sheer technological power. But what exactly happens if, out of absolutely nowhere, 30% of the crucial microscopic parts holding the engines together just mysteriously vanish into thin air? The plane doesn't just slowly glide down to a safe, comfortable landing strip while the flight attendants hand out complimentary bags of peanuts. It immediately experiences catastrophic, fiery engine failure, loses all of its forward momentum, and instantly begins a terrifying death spiral right out of the sky. That is exactly what happens to a highly complex, interconnected society when you suddenly yank out millions of its most reliable, foundational pieces without any warning. The immediate aftermath of this mass disappearance wouldn't just be an emotional tragedy. It would be a complete, unparalleled, systemic collapse on every conceivable level. You would instantly have driverless cars crashing on the freeways, untended power plants going into critical meltdowns, and the global stock market completely evaporating in minutes. The government would be thrown into absolute panicked disarray, desperately trying to figure out where key political figures, military commanders, and intelligence officers went. There would be no more 911 dispatchers answering the phones, no more nurses manning the emergency rooms, and absolutely no way to maintain basic law and order. The nation that once proudly policed the entire globe would suddenly be fighting a terrifying losing battle just to keep the lights on and the water running. It is the ultimate instant checkmate that completely neutralizes the biggest player on the board without firing a single conventional bullet. With the United States completely paralyzed by this terrifying, unexplainable domestic crisis, the entire geopolitical landscape of the world would flip upside down overnight. The massive power vacuum left behind by a crippled America would create the absolute perfect golden opportunity for a new global leader to quickly step up. If you are a rising dictator in Europe or the Middle East, you are no longer worried about the American military intervening in your grand, apocalyptic plans. The great Western deterrent is completely gone, leaving Israel and the rest of the world entirely vulnerable to the exact evil alliances we discussed earlier. It is a chillingly elegant explanation for why the United States is glaringly absent from the chaotic final 7 years of tribulation described in the Book of Revelation. The world's biggest superpower doesn't need to be slowly defeated in a decades-long conventional war. It just gets instantly disqualified from the fight. This vanishing act perfectly explains the sudden silence of the West, leaving the global stage wide open for the darkest chapters of human history to finally unfold. But even with the salt and light entirely removed from the earth, there is still one more terrifying puzzle piece concerning America's ultimate physical fate. Some biblical scholars argue that the silent disappearance is really just the opening act, paving the way for a much more violent, fiery conclusion down the road. They point to a very specific, incredibly obscure prophecy tucked away in the Old Testament that speaks of a sudden, unimaginable devastation falling upon distant shores. It describes a horrific scenario where people living completely undisturbed, falsely believing they are protected by vast oceans, are suddenly awakened by a blinding, inescapable destruction. You really have to wonder what kind of apocalyptic fire could possibly reach across the sea to strike a nation that foolishly thought it was completely untouchable. Have you ever noticed how geography can create a dangerously false sense of absolute security for an entire nation? For hundreds of years, the United States has relied heavily on two massive oceans to act as giant, impenetrable walls, protecting it from the world's chaos. We watch horrifying conflicts unfold in the Middle East or Europe on our television screens, feeling completely detached and perfectly safe in our cozy, isolated hemisphere. It is an incredibly comforting illusion, making average citizens believe that the horrific realities of global warfare can simply never reach their quiet suburban neighborhoods. But that deep-seated, confident assumption of absolute geographical safety is exactly what makes one specific ancient prophecy so incredibly terrifying to read today. It suggests that our massive watery borders might not be the impenetrable shield we have always desperately wanted them to be when the end truly comes. Tucked away in the very same ancient text that predicts the massive invasion of Israel, there is a chilling, single-sentence warning that most people completely miss. Right stroke after God declares that he will miraculously destroy the invading armies of Russia and Iran, he adds a deeply unsettling footnote in Ezekiel chapter 39, verse 6. He clearly states, "I will send fire on Magog and on those who live in safety in the coastlands, and they shall know that I am the Lord." Now, the word coastlands, or isles in ancient Hebrew poetry, was frequently used to describe distant, far-off continents located way beyond the Mediterranean Sea. It specifically refers to nations that are sitting comfortably miles away from the epicenter of the conflict, completely convinced that they are untouchable and perfectly secure. And when you look at a modern map, it is genuinely hard to find a better description of the Western world, specifically the heavily guarded Americas. The phrasing the prophet uses here is absolutely crucial to understanding the sheer gravity of what is actually about to happen to these distant nations. He explicitly targets those who live in safety, which implies a deep, almost arrogant level of confidence in their own national security and military deterrence. These are people who go to sleep every single night without the slightest fear of an air raid siren, trusting entirely in their advanced missile defense systems. They are completely oblivious to the rapidly approaching danger, totally consumed by their daily routines, political debates, and comfortable modern lifestyles far away from the front line. It is the exact same dangerous, blinding complacency that we talked about earlier with the sinking Titanic right before the icy reality finally broke through the hull. This prophecy specifically targets the dangerously comfortable, dropping an apocalyptic reality check right onto the shores of the most heavily defended real estate on Earth. But what exactly is this mysterious, devastating fire that suddenly rains down on these distant, unsuspecting coastlines, while the Middle East is already exploding in chaos? For centuries, theologians struggled to understand how a localized conflict in Israel could instantly result in burning cities on the complete opposite side of the planet. They imagined metaphorical fires, spiritual judgments, or perhaps some kind of massive global natural disaster triggered by the hand of God himself during the battle. However, in our modern hyper-militarized era, we unfortunately don't have to use our imaginations very much to understand exactly how this horrific scenario physically plays out. When you consider the vast arsenals of intercontinental ballistic missiles currently sitting in hidden silos across the globe, the ancient text suddenly becomes chillingly, practically literal. It describes a horrifying split-second exchange of thermonuclear destruction that instantly bridges the vast geographical gap between the eastern and western hemispheres. Imagine the absolute paralyzing shock of a nation that has spent trillions of dollars on defense, suddenly realizing that its massive oceans can no longer protect it. In a matter of mere minutes, the impenetrable fortress is violently breached, and the deep, comfortable illusion of absolute Western security is permanently shattered into a million pieces. The prophet makes it abundantly clear that this terrifying event isn't just random collateral damage. It is a very specific, divine wake-up call to an arrogant world. The text bluntly says that through this unimaginable fire, the surviving nations will finally know that I am the Lord, stripping away all of their earthly pride. When the greatest, most technologically advanced superpower is violently brought to its knees, the rest of the planet instantly realizes that human military strength is ultimately completely useless. It forcefully removes the last remaining pillar of human arrogance, leaving the entire world incredibly vulnerable and desperately searching for answers in the smoldering radioactive rubble. This sudden, fiery devastation on the coastlands paints a grim, undeniable picture of exactly why the Western superpower is completely missing from the final, apocalyptic chapters. Between the slow, internal rotting of a divided house, the sudden, paralyzing shock of millions disappearing, and the terrifying reality of distant, raining fire, the stage is finally set. The greatest nation in human history has been systematically removed from the grand geopolitical chessboard, leaving behind a massive, dark void that simply begs to be filled. It forces every single one of us to take a hard, uncomfortable look in the mirror and completely reevaluate where we are actually placing our ultimate trust. Because if the most powerful, heavily defended nation on Earth can vanish in a chaotic flash, then everything we thought we knew about security is fundamentally flawed. We have to start asking ourselves the truly difficult questions before that final, catastrophic countdown officially begins, and before the real story actually starts to unfold. We've just looked at the undeniable signs, the ancient texts, and the uncomfortable geopolitical realities that nobody else wants to talk about. So, the ultimate question you have to ask yourself right now is this: where exactly are you placing your absolute trust? Are you putting your faith in a deeply divided government, a fragile economy, or a military superpower that the Bible explicitly says will fade into the background. If the strongest, most heavily defended nation in human history isn't guaranteed a spot in tomorrow's final act, how can you keep living your life as if this comfortable illusion will last forever? It is time to wake up, step out of the cultural matrix, and completely reevaluate your entire foundation. You have to stop relying on a collapsing earthly system and start anchoring your life to the only spiritual kingdom that will actually survive what is coming. What specific changes are you going to make today, right now, knowing that this prophetic clock is ticking faster than ever before? Drop a comment down below and tell me, what is the very first step you are taking to spiritually and mentally prepare yourself for these upcoming events? I want to know what you think, and I read every single one of your insights. If you refuse to be blindly led by the mainstream narrative and want to continue uncovering these deep, hidden biblical truths with me, you need to become a part of this community right away. Hit that subscribe button, turn on all the notifications, and join us on this investigative journey. The geopolitical stage is officially being set, and you absolutely cannot afford to miss the next piece of the puzzle. I'll see you in the next video.